Hi there, welcome back. I hope you're all keeping well. So I've had a bunch of people ask me to make a video about my template, so here it is. Let's dive in. So the first thing I have to say is that I only have one template. I use this for everything, most of it being producing soundtracks. At the time of making this video, the template has 1148 tracks, as you can see, and is divided by different sections that we'll be covering right now. The first section is the orchestra section, divided by families, plus an extra layering section that has got some extras. We'll be seeing that later. Then there's another section that covers more mainstream genres like rock, indie, jazz, Latin, etc. Then an ethnic one that features instruments from all around the world. And finally, a synths, pads, drones one. After that, we find the mixing portion of the template. First, there's the groups, where I'll do all my mixing, then the parallel compression tracks, and finally the portion I use to print stems. Last but not least, I've got my mastering tracks, then a track for temp music, and finally one for reference mixes. Also, my reverb tracks are not in my main window, but here. So without further ado, let's start from the top. The first folder features Infinite Woodwinds, which is a library that uses sample modeling technology. Now, if you ask me, in terms of realism nowadays, the best result you can get comes from combining traditional sample libraries with sample modeling technology. The former creates the realism and the presence, while the latter creates the flexibility and the detail. If you want me to make a video about this, by the way, just let me know in the comments. The second folder features legato patches by Spitfire Symphony Woodwinds. You'll see how the Spitfire Symphony series is the backbone of my orchestral template. It's by far my favorite. Also, it features some legato patches from the Berlin Woodwind series that I used to use back in the day, but not so much nowadays. Sometimes people ask me why I love the Spitfire Symphony series so much. And obviously there are several reasons for that. It sounds fantastic, it's got lots of different articulations, but it also, the main thing is that it sounds very wet. When you're mixing an element with an orchestra, if the new element you're trying to mix in is wetter than the orchestra, that can become quite problematic. Whereas if it is the other way around, if the orchestra is the wet element, just making the new element as wet as the orchestra is much easier. That's why, to me, a wet orchestra library is more flexible, because it can easily take in more elements, whether that be layering elements or different instruments altogether. Another thing is that, to me, realism doesn't come so much from showing what you do very well, but from hiding what you do not do so well. I often find that dry libraries that try to be very detailed don't sound as good because you can tell all the legato transitions, the crossfades and all that. All the artificial stuff becomes more noticeable. Whereas with wet ones, all these things are kind of blurred out. They are way less noticeable. Another thing I haven't mentioned yet is the MIDI flags, which are these MIDI regions at the beginning of the session. MIDI flags basically set a default value for MIDI parameters, in this case MIDI volume, modulation, expression and vibrato. And as you can see, I like to have my modulation and expression sitting right at the center. This gives me more leeway both above and underneath. Another element is the negative track delay. As you can see, each track has a negative track delay value. This is very important, so all the legato transitions, attacks and so on align when playing back, otherwise it's an absolute mess. Also, I must say that I don't play anything in, everything is quantized to the grid. The next folder is for shorts. As you can see, I've got different shorts and they are set up with articulation sets. I don't like key switches, I find them very fluffy. In the next folder, we find anything that is not a legato or a short. So we find all the flutters, all the trills, etc. Finally, in the last folder, we find all the double tongues and plets. I don't use this so much because I have the same thing with the Spitfire Symphony series. These are by Berlin. And as you can see, they are hidden. All these green H's means that they are hidden. So that's about it for Woodwinds. Now let's get into brass. It's very similar to Woodwinds in a way, so we'll do this much faster. So same as before, the first folder is for layering. We find infinite brass, as well as sample modeling the horn, the trumpet, the trombone and the tuba, which is the same as the horn really. But yeah, I usually go for infinite brass for consistency with the Woodwinds. Also, I haven't said this before, but the sample modeling layering thing works best in solo contexts. In a tutti passage, it gives it some definition, I guess, but it's not very noticeable. In those cases, I would go for something different, something more stereotypically cinematic that's got that inherent thickness to its sound. Next up, in the next folder, we find all the legatos and all the other articulations that are not shorts or legatos. They're all set up with articulation sets as before, and in terms of libraries, we find Spitfire Symphony Brass and certain patches from Cinebrass and Cinematic Studio Brass. In the next folder, we find the shorts featuring the same libraries I mentioned in the previous folder. After that, we've got the percussion section. As you can see, we've got several subfolders for this. But what I use 90% of the time is basically this, which is the, again, Spitfire Symphony series, as well as all the percussions from the Albions. The rest of the section is made up by patches from Cineperc, which is the library I used to use back in the day. I still use them sometimes, but as I said before, most of the time I stick to the Spitfire Symphony series. The next section comprises the harp, the piano, and the celeste, and same as before, they come from Spitfire Symphony series. Then there's the choir section, for which I use mainly Lacrimosa and Voxos. And right after that, we find the string section, which is probably the biggest section there is in the template. For this, I use three libraries, the first one being, you might have guessed by now, Spitfire Symphony Strings, along with Spitfire Chamber Strings and Spitfire Solo Strings. These three libraries work incredibly well with each other. Not only have they been programmed the exact same way and have been recorded in the same space, so they sound very similar, but they also fill in each other's gaps very well too. You get the very rich depth from the Spitfire Symphonic Strings, then the definition and density from Chamber Strings, and finally that first stand detail from Solo Strings. You've probably seen by now that I've got more libraries here. I've got Cine Strings Solo, Cinematic Studio Strings, and Cinematic Studio Strings Solo. I used to use them back in the day, but at some point I stopped. You know, I am among those very few people that don't think they are exceptional. They are very good, don't get me wrong, and I think they can get you 80% there very well and very quickly. But if you want to bridge that gap and make your mockup as realistic as possible, I think they are better options. Also, and this is something I learned with time, I think there's an inherent advantage to having all your template, or as much of the template as possible, by the same manufacturer, in that if it is programmed the same way, when it comes to copying and pasting, all the workflow becomes much more streamlined. I remember back in the day when my template used to be made up by libraries from all sorts of different manufacturers, I would have to spend so much time tweaking automation curves and such every time I would copy and paste MIDI data onto different tracks just for layering's sake. And it was quite chaotic, honestly, and very slow. Now, with that being said, I have not deleted these tracks just in case, but I haven't used them in a very long time. Also, this track here is just a synth that plays a sine wave to double down an octave the bass, which is a very typical technique. The next folder also has to do with legato, but in this case, it has to do with the VC. The Spitfire Symphonic Strings doesn't have a solution for the VC really, so I had to create one. For this, I use Albion Lock Greer, which features a smaller section than the original Albion 1 or Legacy. Spitfire Chamber Strings, Spitfire Albion Neo, which also features a smaller section, a different type of smaller section, but smaller section nevertheless. And finally, Spitfire Solstice, Spitfire Albion Solstice, that has an octet and a sextet. So yeah, depending on the context, I would go for one or the other. And again, as you might have seen, everything's by Spitfire. Everything has been programmed the same way, recorded in the same studio, which is Hayes Studios. So everything sounds very similar. And yeah, it improves my workflow a lot. Finally, I've got some special legato patches for sul G, sul D, but also for other articulations like sordino, portamento, flautando, sul pont, etc. After this, we find the shorts, and same as before, we find different articulations set up with articulation sets. The next folder is for ensemble patches. The first two tracks have all the articulations available for Spitfire Symphonic Strings and Chamber Strings, and the rest of them work in twos, in pairs, as you can see. And they are articulations that I use most of the time, or more than others, and have got a more fine-tuned volume balancing. They are articulations that, in my view, wouldn't warrant having them written on specific instrument tracks, meaning that in most cases, for instance, if I needed to write some pizzicati, I would just grab the ensemble patches and just roll with it instead of splitting them into, for instance, violin twos and violas or something like that. Then I've got an entire folder just dedicated to tremolos. It's an articulation that I use quite a bit, and yeah, it makes sense for me. And finally, for the strings, same thing as before. We've got all the different articulations available. There are for each individual instrument for the three string libraries I use. And yeah, having your entire template set up with articulation sets takes an absurd amount of time, but you only have to do it once. And once you've done it, the amount of time you spare yourself is insane. Your workflow becomes much more efficient. Also, it's very important to know where to draw the line, as in what's going to have its dedicated tracks and what's going to be articulation sets. In an ideal scenario, you would have a dedicated track for each individual articulation and instrument, right? So you could have more control over each individual negative track delay, volume balancing, and so on. But your template would be so absurdly big that it wouldn't be feasible, really. So that's what I meant by knowing where to draw the line, as in knowing which articulations warrant having their own dedicated tracks. And that, to me, that is pretty much legato, shorts, and a few others, but those two mainly. So up until now, we've covered the bread and butter of the orchestral section of my template, but sometimes I need to layer in other libraries. For instance, when I'm after an old school sound, I use the Bernard Herrmann Composer Toolkit for that. If I needed something rather epic instead, I would probably layer in Albion Mass, Albion 1, Niceni, or Legacy. And if I needed something more intimate or experimental, I would probably go for Albion Logria, Neo, Solstice, or Tundra. But again, in most cases, this would be the fine-tuning. The actual heavy lifting would have been done previously with the Spitfire Symphony series. Then we've got the Spitfire British Drummer Toolkit, which is a library I like a lot. It's very intimate, very up close, and I've certainly used it quite a bit. After that, we find a folder with two libraries by Project Sam. The first one is Colors, which is very useful to give realism to certain combinations of instruments and also textures. And then there is Runs, which is quite self-explanatory, really. Finally, in the last orchestral folder, we find Noises and Effects. There are several libraries here. Some of them we have seen already, some of them are new. Among the new ones, we find Albion Uist, which features the longest articulation set I've ever done. Also have Orchestral Swarm, Time Micro, Time Macro, Cage, Spitfire's HG2O, and Spitfire's Alternative Solo Strings. This folder is quite big, as you can see. I find that with Noises and Effects, you can't never have enough. So yeah, that's all there is for orchestral stuff. Now let's move on to something else. The next folder revolves around what I usually call the traditional band format, so anything that has to do with guitars, basses, drum kits, etc. In terms of libraries, as far as acoustic guitars go, I make use of a couple by Session Guitarist. One is a Strummed Acoustic 2, and the other one is Picked Acoustic. I also make use of this one, which is called Sketched Nylon, which has got more of a Spanish flamenco sound. I love it. I've used it a lot. In terms of basses, my go-to is Prime Bass by Session Bassist. And for doubling, I tend to use some of the Scarbys. They are very old, but still usable in my opinion. And I also have a couple of acoustic basses by Ethno World. They are not phenomenal, but in terms of acoustic basses, that's all I have. If you know of any other acoustic basses, please let me know in the comments. In terms of drum kits, my go-to is Studio Drummer. And if I needed to make something more old school, I would probably go for one of the drum kits by the Abbey Road collection. They are very old, all of them. But I find in genres like rock and such, the way you process drum kits goes a very long way. So I've never had the need to update my drum kits. The next folder is for pads, as in guitar pads. And I've got lots of patches by Apollo and Albion Solstice. That's a very interesting one. Also Spitfire Ambient Guitars Evo Grid, which I find very creatively stimulating. Yeah, that's it really. The next section revolves around anything that falls under the what I call jazz Latin umbrella. So anything from blues to bossa nova, rumba, etc. In terms of pianos, I've got a couple pianos by Swing More, then another one by Vintage Rhythm Section, and the piano by the Cool Jazz collection. In terms of basses, I've got the basses that come with Swing and Swing More. In terms of guitars, I've got a bunch of tracks dedicated to grooves of various genres. And in terms of libraries, I've got several by In Session Audio, namely fingerstyle folk acoustic guitar, Latin jazz guitar, and resonator guitar. I also have another one by Big Fish Audio called Guitarra Spanish Guitar. more dedicated to flamenco inspired grooves. And in terms of lead guitars, I've got a couple banjos and the 3 lead guitars from Swing More. As far as drum kits go, I've got the 2 drum kits by Swing and Swing More, then the drum kit from the Cool Jazz collection, and finally a vintage drummer from the Abbey Road collection. Also, same as before, I've got a bunch of patches dedicated to grooves, in this case jazz grooves. I find them very useful to jumpstart your arrangement, to have like a template to build on top of. And finally, in this last folder, we've got percussions, beyond drum kits, I mean, as in percussion bits and so on. I've got a bunch of patches by Spotlight Collection Cuba, as well as Swing More, Shimmer Shake Strike 1 and 2. And yeah, that's about it. And they also have a bunch of patches by Albion 2 Logria, which they called Byron tapes, which consists of like grooves from a variety of genres. Is very, very interesting. You would never expect to find something like that in an Albion, really. Next up, we've got the ethnic section dedicated to instruments from all over the world, in traditional instruments. So the first folder is dedicated to winds, and the way the tracks are set up is through multis. This means that each track's contact instance has got 16 patches loaded into it, and all the MIDI channels are set to Omni. And the way I would go about this would be just go into contact, solo the patch I'm interested in, and use it. And to make that search easier, I've got all the instrument's origins written on the track name. I find this system works best for me. I absolutely hate browsing inside contact. I think it's very fluffy. Yeah, very, very clunky, very time consuming. In terms of libraries, pretty much everything comes from Ethnoworld, but there are also some patches from Ventus Ethnic Winds and Native Instruments Spotlight collection. When it comes to these ethnic libraries, I don't think their capabilities in terms of realism performance are very important compared to having lots of music samples from that culture's music. This is because in most cases, if for instance you need a Serbian instrument, chances are it's because you need to write some Serbian music, and if you don't have a very specific knowledge about that music's DNA, if you will, you won't be able to wing it. So that's when all these pre-recorded bits of traditional music come in handy very much. In terms of strings, they are divided by bowed strings and plucked strings. And in terms of percussion, they are divided by just general percussion and tuned percussion. I also have one track dedicated to ensembles, in this case Asian ensembles, and one dedicated to keys. In terms of voices, they are divided by men's voices, women's voices, mixed choirs voices, and one track for children's voices. So that's all there is for ethnic stuff. And now let's move on to the last section, which is synths, pads, and drones. When it comes to these types of libraries, I find that you need lots and lots of them. So you've got to be quite efficient with your space management in your template. And the way I get around this is again through articulation sets or multis. For instance, as far as the first track goes, a contemporary toolkit library, I've got the entire library loaded onto a single track through a very long articulation set. And when it comes to multis, it's a case of having 16 patches at a time. So as you can see, there's lots and lots of different patches in this section. And again, I do this as a lesser evil type of option because browsing inside contact can be quite an unpleasant experience. Not always though. There are libraries that have got very good search functionalities within them, and for those I would just load a single patch. We'll see some of these in a minute. This is one of them, for instance. This library is called Laws, and as you can see, it's very easy to scroll through all the presets. It's got menus and filters and so on. So for these types of libraries, I would just load a single patch, as I was saying. We've got Tundra's Evo Grid, we've got Spitfire's Percussion Swarm, some voice synths by Sant Iron, very cool ones. Then all the libraries by Oliver Arnolds, not including the ones that just launched. Some of them are a bit redundant. Also, we have lots of patches by Ambient Guitars, by Spitfire again, Tundra again, Albion 1, all the Etnas, Albion Legacy, Logria, Isani, Uist, Albion Neo, Evolve Mutations, the very, very old ones, HG2O Synths by Spitfire again, Ondine, that's a very interesting synth, lots of patches by Heaviosity, Aeon Melodic, and lots and lots of patches by Spitfire's Edna's Earth. And keep in mind that even though in this folder alone there are over 1,000 patches, these are only my favorite ones. So yeah, I've had to go through each individual folder and subfolder within Contact and yeah, select my favorite ones. Yeah, this takes an absurd amount of time. In the next folder, which I've called Noises and Synths, we've got some patches by Keep Forest, more like cinematic trailer oriented. Then we've got Baby Audio's BA1 and Atoms, two synths that I absolutely love. I couldn't recommend them enough. Then there's Twin 2 by Fat Filter and Vital. Further on, we find The Giant, Analog Strings, Ditch Hybrid 2, which is a very interesting one, then Harpospheres, which are part of the Spitfire Symphony Harp, Floyd Strike, Mysteria, Thrill, some patches by Growth and the Jade Ethnic Orchestra, more ambient oriented, and finally 5 Elements. In the next folder, which is called Keys, we find some Oliver Arnold's pianos and Una Corda. Finally, the very last instruments folder, which is called Cinematic Percussion, contains, guess what, cinematic percussion stuff. We find Gravity 2, Damage 2, Drums of War, Growth, and some patches by Keep Forest again. Finally, as I said at the beginning, I always keep 10 open instruments here, which are just empty Contact instances, just in case I need to search something that is not built into the template. The next folder is the Arrangements folder and contains just empty piano tracks. Here is where I would just compose and flesh out my arrangements before programming them, before just copying and pasting MIDI data, drawing automation lines, etc. And it contains 2 tracks for strings, 1 for brass, 2 for woodwinds, and 1 for extra. It's very important that they are different colors, so when you select all the MIDI events for all of them, you can easily see which instruments family plays what. If you check out some of my arrangement tutorials, you can see this in practice. So what's left of the template has to do with mixing, mastering, and delivering music. The next folder, which is called Groups, contains buses that funnel all the instruments in the template. So for instance, in the case of the first one, flutes, all the tracks, all the instrument tracks that have to do with flutes, where they are long, short, other articulations, piccolo, alto flutes, bass flute, etc., they all go to flutes. And the same goes for all the tracks in this folder. Now here is where I would do all my mixing. If we take a look at the mixer, the first thing we find is an EQ instance that in most cases is not doing anything, not anything yet. The actual built-in EQ is on each individual instrument track, as you can see at the moment, that basically addresses easy fixes like low-end room noise, tone correction, and resonances specific to each individual instrument and things like that. So harking back to the groups folder, after the first EQ instance, where I would apply EQ to that group of instruments specifically, but globally, we find an instance of gain. And in the case of low instruments like bassoons or double basses, there is an instance of Fat Filter's Pro MB, which is a multiband compressor to make sure that the low end is controlled and is not jerky, really. The first send we find is the parallel compression send. So each bus has got a send to a different bus, where a compressor is properly squashing the signal. Then the heavily compressed signal is fed back into the mix ever so slightly to give it that thickness. The next send, which is set to unity, as you can see, goes to a bus that is muted. The purpose of this track is to feed the smooth operator's sidechain that is loaded onto each individual reverb track. I'll show you how that works in a minute. The last 2 sends are my reverb sends. Now, this is how I have my reverbs set up. I've got 2 reverbs for orchestral settings, 2 others for non-orchestral settings, and 1 delay for stuff in general. For orchestral settings, I tend to use Fat Filter's Reverb. I like it quite a bit. And I tend to have 2 of them, one to handle the early reflections and another one for the tail. I have to say though that most of my libraries, my orchestral libraries in this template, are already quite wet. So I've got to be quite careful with how I handle the reverbs. And a couple of things that help a lot with this is first having an EQ cut off everything below 200 Hz before and after the plugin, and then then a smooth operator instance. The smooth operator instance is set to sidechain, and it's being fed the dry signal from the send I was mentioning earlier that is set to unity, which is basically the dry signal of the entire mix. This basically means that when the mix is very loud, that triggers a smooth operator more, resulting in the reverb being pushed back not only in volume but also throughout the spectrum. It's a very simple trick, but it makes your reverb sound so much cleaner. I also have a compressor instance to do basically the same thing, just in case I need more of that reverb being pushed back. The other two reverbs I use, which are not orchestral, they are more for sound design and creative stuff, are by Baby Audio, the two of them. One is Spaced Out and the other one is Crystalline. They are very creative, very, creatively stimulating, shall we say. Also, I have a delay already loaded onto one track in case I would need it. Obviously, I would use it as a synth. And I'm using Baby Audio's comeback kit, which I absolutely love. The next section has to do with stem printing, and it works like this. All these are a second layer of buses, all right? So for instance, in the first one, which are flutes, are converging both the dry signal from the flutes, from the groups folder, plus the parallel compressed signal from the parallel compression send. And the same goes for each individual bus, each individual instrument. So the way I print stems is by having audio tracks that are individually recording each of these buses. And as you can see, there is one for each. All these tracks are audio tracks. So for instance, if we take a look at the flutes bus, which is the sum of the flutes group, which is the dry signal, plus the parallel compressed flute, is feeding the audio track flutes stem, and the exact same goes for all the other instruments. So if I need to print stems, I would just select all these stems tracks, hit record, and then just export all the audio files, which takes a moment. So there's only the mastering section left. Now, the way I handle mastering is in 3 stages, really. In the first one, I split the signal into mid and side. The first thing I would do would be to control nasty resonances with dynamic EQ. Then a first instance of compression, in this case glue compression, then some EQ, and finally another instance of compression. Now both mid and side would be fed into the master bus. Here I've got an instance of Plasma by Isotope, a very interesting plugin. It got launched not long ago. And finally, an instance of Ozone. Inside Ozone, I've got certain plugins that are already loaded, as you can see, which are Spectral Shaper, Clarity, Equalizer, Vintage EQ, Exciter, Vintage Tape, and Imager. I don't use them all the time, but most of the time. And finally, on the stereo out, the first thing we find is a gain plugin that basically, in this case, just collapses the signal to mono. I've got the bypass button panned to my MIDI controller, so I can just switch it on and off as I go along. At the touch of a button is very convenient to check mono compatibility. After that, we find 3 limiters. The first one by Fat Filter, the typical Pro L2, and then the ones that come with Ozone. After that, we find 3 plugins for monitoring. The first one being Tonal Balance Control, then Span, and finally Insight. And finally, since I work on headphones, I use the Audio-Technica R70Xs. I've got Sound ID with the R70X's profile loaded into it, and then a can opener for the Phantom Center. So that's about it. This is my template. Obviously, it is a lot of work, but keep in mind that I've been building it throughout years. I've watched a million videos about templates, about what people use and don't. But also, it's the result of a lot of experimentation, a lot of work. Only through actual work, you get to see what works for you, what you like, what you don't, and get to discover your own workflow. So I hope you found this video helpful. Please let me know if you have any questions. Drop them in the comment section down below. And yeah, feel free to subscribe if you like this stuff, like the video, and yeah, see you around. Cheers.